on behalf of the School of Public Policy, allow me to all welcome you to today's event here in CU's auditorium, and also, and in particular, welcome those viewing the stream coverage online. I understand there are quite a number of people that have signed up for this. As we are wrapping up the school's inaugural year, in today's discussions we shall address one of the most important public policy issues of recent times, and an issue that is likely to keep us very, very busy for the foreseeable future. I'm sure you all agree with me, and that is the impact of mass state surveillance policy on fundamental human rights. The disclosure by the whistleblower Edward Snowden since June 2013 concerning the mass surveillance programs of the US National Security Agency and its international partners, notably the UK government communications headquarters, have raised a myriad of rights-based and rule of law concerns and questions that remain and probably will for some time remain unanswered. Now, many of these concerns emphasize how such mass surveillance programs infringe upon the right to privacy, lack of transparency, as well as any meaningful democratic oversight, particularly through the courts. And so the reach and enormity of the surveillance operations revealed has undoubtedly also eroded public trust in government's respect of such proper limits of such programs. And our own SPP distinguished visiting professor A.J. Nair very succinctly highlighted some of these concerns in his lecture on surveillance, secrecy, and disclosure, which was hosted by the School of Public Policy not too long ago, and I'm sure some of you were able to attend it. Now, while those issues remain legitimate and pressing concerns, today's event hones in on the other key and related right highlighted by the Snowden case alongside privacy, and that is the right to freedom of expression, particularly media freedom, a right which goes to the heart of the founding values of this university and, of course, that of an open society. And so this event brings together a range of individuals from intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, as well as journalists and scholars, to discuss and debate these and related issues in an attempt to identify possibility and prospects for legal and policy reform. Unfortunately, I'd like to alert you to one change in the program. Andre Goodfriend, who is the chargé d'affaires at the Embassy of the United States here in Budapest and was included initially in this first panel discussion, had to withdraw his participation. This event is hosted by the School of Public Policy's Center for Media and Communication Studies as part of the Strengthening Journalism in Europe project, which is co-financed by the European Commission and carried out in partnership with the Center for Media Pluralism and Freedom at the European University Institute in Florence. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Sejal Parmar, who will moderate this first panel. Sejal, as many of you know, is an assistant professor in the Department of Legal Studies here at CEU, and her research and teaching lie broadly in the field of international human rights law, currently focusing on the recent approach of human rights bodies towards freedom of expression and its interplay with other rights such as equality, interests, and national security. Prior to coming to CEU, Sejal worked as a senior legal officer at Article 19, the leading international human rights NGO on freedom of expression, and before that as the human rights coordinator at Doughty Street Chambers in London. She also taught international and European human rights law courses at Queen Mary, University of London, and the University of Edinburgh, and previously she held research positions at the New York University Law School, the Amsterdam Center for International Law, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Sejal, thank you very much, and thank you all panelists for coming here this afternoon. We look very much forward to your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. A series of events about a year ago led up to today's panel discussions, inspired them. Edward Snowden arrived in Hong Kong, where he met Guardian journalists Glenn Greenwald, Ewan MacAskill, and the documentary filmmaker Laura Poitras, to whom he identified himself with that very particular Hungarian artifact, the Rubik's Cube, The disclosures that Snowden, an infrastructure analyst and defense contractor employee, made to those journalists on the vast scale and scope of the surveillance activities by the US National Security Agency, but also the UK's government communications headquarters and their Five Eyes partners, have sparked one of the great global debates of our time. The reverberation of Snowden's release of material, characterized by Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg as the greatest or the most important leak in US history, will be felt for many years. Snowden's leaks, as reported in The Guardian and The Washington Post since June 2013, reveal that the NSA has been bulk collecting and storing metadata, phone records of Americans, but also analyzing the contents of emails and other internet communications of people around the world in collaboration with other security agencies such as GCHQ. Snowden's that the NSA does and can listen into the phone conversations, including of the leaders of allied countries such as Brazil, Mexico, and Germany. Since last summer, Snowden's disclosures have at the domestic level a presidential review panel and a subsequent speech by President Obama outlining a series of surveillance reforms, legislative debates in Congress, and proposals for legislative reform and policy change, such as the USA Freedom Act, and the beginning of a pressure in the UK towards reform, as the Home Affairs Select Committee report earlier this week identified. There's also been constitutional challenges by civil liberties groups, such as the ACLU in the States and Liberty in the UK. And also, more fundamentally and more generally, a loss of public trust in governments that states will protect rights whilst conducting their surveillance operations. At the regional level, there has been pressure on intergovernmental institutions, such as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and various European bodies, to shape or put pressure on governments in relation to their national security operations. And at the global level, there have been two significant General Assembly and Human Rights Council resolutions on the right to privacy in a digital age. This public debate at the global level has, as Glenn Greenwald had said, pitted individual rights on the one hand, particularly privacy, and to a lesser extent freedom of expression. These rights whose limits seem fuzzy and difficult to identify in the digital age especially, with state security interests on the other. As Greenwald has said, the instinctive and visceral danger that you and your children are going to be blown up by terrorists. Current surveillance operations, especially of the US, essentially assume first that indiscriminate scooping of metadata is necessary because you need a haystack to find a needle. Second, that there is no privacy interest in metadata anyway. Third, the content of communications of those outside the United States may be subject to scrutiny. All this is coupled with attempts by government authorities in the UK and the US especially to put pressure on journalists who are leaking, exchanging, and publishing information on mass surveillance programs as they are perceived to be a threat to national security. As the Dean has already indicated, this event seeks to identify how disclosures of the revelations of mass surveillance and also the responses of states to their reporting has engaged freedom of expression, a right fundamentally connected with privacy, but which has received less attention in the mass surveillance public debate. Snowden's revelations of mass surveillance regimes have reportedly chilled the speech of lawyers and NGOs, but this event focuses squarely on the impact on the media and on journalists. How has media freedom and the rights of journalists been threatened by mass surveillance, and what should and can be done to strengthen media freedom, journalists' rights, and freedom of expression generally in this era of mass surveillance? I'm not going to explain the backgrounds of the very eminent speakers I have with me on this panel. Hopefully all of you have a handout with the biographies, but I'll ask them to make a short presentation. But before I do that, I'd like to ask a question to you now. Did Snowden's disclosures and the Guardian's publication of them, in your view, pose a real risk to national security? Please raise your hand if you think they did. Okay, so about 4 or 5 people, which is a very small minority in this room. Let's turn to our first speaker, Jill Phillips, the head of legal at The Guardian. Jill, as the Guardian's main lawyer, you've been at the very heart of the Snowden story from the very beginning. I know you were in Hong Kong at the time that Snowden chose to go public with his identity. How has The Guardian, its journalists and its editor been affected by the reporting on the Snowden revelations?
Hello. Everyone can hear me, yeah? Well, I think you never go into these things quite knowing where they're going to go, and things start off seeming quite small and manageable, and then become much bigger. And I guess this is the third sort of big thing that we've engaged in recent years. Obviously, we had WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and we had phone hacking, and all of those start off as, sort of a journalist coming with something, and then it expands out. And I don't think that you can ever do anything other than embark on the journey and sort of see where the journey takes you. And I was going to spend my sort of 5 or so minutes just starting with some reflections really on some of the legal and journalistic issues that arose for The Guardian as the Snowden story developed. And really the way to do that is to sort of go through it as the journey developed for us. So, we start off, as you say, with a little before Hong Kong, because there's been a little bit of communication going on, but nobody really knows that much about it. I'm in Australia doing something for The Guardian, setting up our website. I get a couple of cryptic calls on the telephone in which I'm told that Alan can't say anything because he's on the telephone and it's very, very secret. And would I mind diverting my journey back from Australia to go to Hong Kong, where I was due to spend a couple of hours on the way back to change flights, etc. And by the time I took my journey, The Guardian had published a couple of the first NSA stories, so I had some idea what had been going on. But then I transport to Hong Kong, and I meet Glenn Greenwald and Ewan McCaskill. As a lawyer, I'm very wary about meeting sources, so I didn't want to meet. Well, I did want to meet, but I didn't meet Snowden because I just think lawyers don't have the same protections that journalists have. Snowden wouldn't be my client. I would have probably no legal privilege. As an employed in-house lawyer, I'm quite restricted in who I can advise. So in terms of me seeing him, being told things, it wasn't very sensible. It was far better to do it through Ewan and Glenn, who were both Guardian employees or engaged in a formal way. So, that's how it started. And initially, we were handling the story in New York. It was a US story. It was about the NSA. It had, on the face of it at the beginning, some fairly peripheral GCHQ references. But it subsequently became apparent that there was quite a lot more GCHQ stuff. And so there was a much higher UK related contact than had maybe initially been thought. And the great thing about the US, and not everything's great about the US, but again, as mentioned, following the Pentagon Papers, prior restraint is pretty much not a problem. In national security cases, the US have a history generally of not prosecuting journalists for publishing this sort of stuff. That's not to say they don't go hard after the person who leaked them, as we've seen with Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, and Ed Snowden himself. And they do prosecute journalists in different ways via source issues. So it's not 100% fantastic there, but it is much easier as a news organisation to publish. And generally speaking, the US authorities will have a mature debate with journalists. You can go to government agencies, tell them what you're doing, and make sure that you're not going to publish things that might be damaging. So the US stuff initially was actually not too problematic. You know, the Espionage Act is there, but you're not that worried about it, to be honest. Once we had the UK stuff coming much more to the fore, then we had to look at things from the UK perspective, where things are really quite different. We don't have a history of mature dialogue with the agencies. We have a history of much greater prior restraint around confidentiality. Spycatcher still lives on in most people's memory. I think, it was 3-4 years before the government finally conceded in Spycatcher that they weren't going to get what they wanted, because actually everybody else knew about it. So what was the point in continuing to pursue the press? And there have been others, Shayla, Tomlinson, Martin Ingram, where, the government have pursued. And so it comes to the UK, and we're looking at it, I have to say, not in terrorism terms. Terrorism did not enter my head when we had the initial discussions around Snowden. Why would it really? It was clearly, there were clearly a lot of discussions which weren't really legal around what the information was, what we were going to publish, about individuals, operations. There were some things that were a complete no-no. And legally, the two things that we were looking at were national security and the Official Secrets Act, primarily. There are a few other bits and pieces of law that might have come up, but generally wouldn't. And that set up a scenario where, when we were publishing the very first GCHQ story, which I think was the 17th of June, which was the G20 conference being bugged. We did not have any prior contact with any of the state agencies, the government. We didn't use the DA notice committee, partly because of concerns over getting bogged down in a legal action where, even if we ultimately came out of it, it might take months or years to resolve. And partly because that story, judged by all our own internal views and some external views, was that it was an embarrassing story. It was not damaging. There was no damage being done under National Security or Official Secrets Act. So that story went out. And, in a way, it's a lesson that we learned from WikiLeaks, which is that there is something to be said for getting the story out in a way that is probably legally as least problematic as you can find. And then the more problematic legal stories you can deal with in a climate where you have already put things into the public domain, so people know what you're talking about. And having got that first story out on the G20, the next really big story was Tempura, and I think that came out on the 21st of June. And following the G20 story, we did start to engage with the government. We started to engage with the agencies, the DA Notice Committee. And once publication started, you sort of felt you'd got over one hurdle. Okay, we've started the debate, we've started getting things out. And legally, lawyers will know that, the longer you go on and the government doesn't come and get you in terms of confidentiality, the harder their case becomes. If they leave it too long, and the longer they leave it. So legally, the risk was lowering in terms of an injunction, but it was still potentially lurking, and it was still potentially problematic. And one of the big concerns for us was that if the government had gone and got some sort of injunction, unravelling the bits of the story and the bits of the information would be really quite complicated, time-consuming. And because we're essentially still a UK-based organisation, an injunction against The Guardian in London would probably practically prevent us reporting in New York as well. So so it could compromise the NSA material that we were also continuing to publish. So it was a complicated scenario that was looming, and we had this sort of dialogue with the government on stories that went on. But suddenly the government, for some reason that we've never really quite understood, ramped up the pressure about the GCHQ material and started to demand that it was, in the first instance, handed back to them, which was very unsatisfactory in all sorts of ways. I mean, why would you want to hand material back? One, okay, Snowden wasn't a confidential source because he'd outed himself, but we didn't know, and I'm not sure that the government or in either the US or the UK still actually know how much material he got and what he got. So if you start handing stuff back, you're giving information away that if you're protecting a source, it's not just about who they are, it's about all sorts of things around them. It's one of the obligations you take on, I think, as a journalistic organisation when you use sources. It would have the Guardian journalists' fingerprints on it. Who'd looked at what? That could put them in difficulties. So all sorts of reasons why what seemed like a relatively easy option, oh, just give it back, was never going to be realistic. So then there was talk about destruction. And actually, from the Guardian's point of view, the point that Alan kept making was that it was a completely pointless exercise because this material was already in New York. Glenn Greenwald had it, Laura Poitras had it, and Ed Snowden had it. So cutting off the Guardian was just, shooting the messenger for absolutely no purpose whatsoever. And a messenger that, was trying to be as responsible and have as much dialogue about what it did as possible. So that all seemed a bit pointless, but eventually the pressure was ramped up to such an extent that in order to really make sure that we could continue to publish, which we could do from New York, absent any court injunction in London, we agreed for GCHQ to come in and destroy the material that we held in London. And 2 GCHQ men came in, you'll all know about it, with this degussa, and Black & Decker drills were employed, and this stuff was ultimately destroyed. And that, in a way, that was the sort of second stage of the proceedings. And there was then, I guess, a sort of uneasy truce until David Miranda was detained in August. So sort of 4 weeks after the GCHQ had been in. And that came out of the blue. It raised all sorts of issues around, how do journalists safely transfer material? How do they communicate with each other? What do they do with these things? And I think one of the things that's come out of a lot of the stuff that's come on is that actually meeting people face-to-face and talking to people face-to-face is probably the safest way to communicate these days because of the way the internet is, irony or not. And once David Miranda was detained, I think...
Maybe explain David Miranda.
Oh, sorry, David Miranda, for those who don't know, was the partner of Glenn Greenwald, who was also helping him with the Snowden story. And he'd been to meet Laura Poitras in Berlin, was coming back from Berlin to Rio, was in transit in Heathrow and was stopped en route. And that throws up all sorts of issues about who's a journalist, what journalistic material is it anything that a journalist has, what role David Miranda plays. I mean, if you look at the Council of Europe recommendation 2007, that has references into people who get protection not just as journalists, but others who are helping journalists. All sorts of issues around that. It also created quite a high level of paranoia for The Guardian about how we continued to transfer, talk about the story, run it. What we realised, which I don't think, again, any of us realised, was that the Terrorism Act, which, as I said, was not uppermost in anyone's minds when we started the journey, could be used in this way to stop something that looked like a complete journalistic endeavour in its tracks on one level. We discovered that under the RIPA legislation there is a power that the police have to order anyone to hand over the password to any electronic item that they have. There's no defence to that. If you refuse, it's the prison sentence is 2 years. That applies to everybody. You may have all sorts of good reasons for not handing it over, but if you don't, that's the outcome. So, we learnt a lot on our journey, things that we didn't really know about before, and we're a bit more savvy about now. And we're educating our journalists about what they should be doing when they're travelling, what their rights are, at least in the UK, with regard to protecting journalistic material, and those sorts of things. So that was a sort of the third stage, in a way, of the journey. And then the fourth and final stage, I suppose, is where we are now, which is the political attack that started on The Guardian, politicians, publicly being attacked by the security services. Malcolm Rifkind refuses to go to the select committee and speak, but criticises us in all sorts of ways. There's a police investigation. That police investigation, as far as we know, is still extant. It's still hanging over us. Of course, those things have a chilling effect on you. That you have to think about those before you make decisions in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. So that's all the sort of the latest stage, if you like. At the moment, it's I suppose entering the fifth stage, which is that David Miranda, who complained in the UK courts about his detention, has now just been given permission to appeal the initial decision. And it will be interesting to see what the higher courts in the UK have to say about it. The initial decision being very disappointing for David Miranda, but also for journalism generally, I think. And all that in the UK compared to what on one level you could say was a much more mature debate going on in Europe around actually what Ed Snowden had told us about what was going on, and also a much more reform-led agenda going on in the US around oversight and those sorts of issues. So that's a very sort of whistle-stop tour through where The Guardian's gone on the Ed Snowden story. But it throws up, I think, quite a lot of the bigger issues that this conference this afternoon is going into. So I'll leave it there, because you've heard probably too much already.
Thank you, Jill. Fascinating insight into the Guardian's journey. Just picking up on a couple of things that you said. Some of you may be aware that the Guardian's editor, Alan Rusbridger, was hauled up before I think the Home Affairs Select Committee back in December last year. And the chair of that committee, Keith Vaz, asked him, do you love your country, Mr. Rusbridger? So it's come to that where the editor of The Guardian is being asked about his patriotism. And just on that final point about the appeal of David Miranda against the decision of the High Court that his detention was lawful, that appeal is based on freedom of expression and freedom of the media. So to see how freedom of expression is really interlocking with many of the issues that The Guardian is facing, and the particular case of David Miranda. Moving away from The Guardian's particular story to the state's perspective now, Martin Scheinen, Professor of International Law and Human Rights at the European University Institute, and from 2005 to 2011, UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights, leads a significant project on surveillance funded by the European Commission, and researches the surveillance topic from both angles, from the security angle and also the human rights angle. Martin, in your research, what have you found in terms of why states, security agencies, feel the need to deploy surveillance in the name of security? And is it possible to balance the interest in surveillance with those of rights? Thank you, Martin.
Thanks for the questions, Angel, and thanks for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be at the Central European University. Indeed, I am in charge of a multi-year project called Surveil, Surveillance, Ethical Issues, Legal Limitations and Efficiency, where we are trying to look into various surveillance technologies and assess them on a multidimensional basis. The last word, efficiency, relates to technology but also to the cost of surveillance. Does it work? Is it worth the money? Then we ask, where are the ethical issues? And separately from the ethics, we look at the legal limitations upon surveillance. I will take a step back in the sense that as we have identified that the first order implications upon human rights are through privacy and the right to protection of personal data. That's the primary entry point to our human rights analysis. Of course, there is then the freedom of expression issue to which I will relate, but bear with me because I have to say something about privacy and data protection still. A 2-minute crash course on privacy and freedom of expression as human rights. First of all, it needs to be said that both of these rights are human rights, and that means that they are legal obligations of states. To be more specific, every state in the world has voluntarily ratified one or more human rights treaties that contain freedom of expression and the right to privacy, both of them. Some countries, less than a handful, have ratified them only for persons under 18 years of age, Convention on Rights of the Child, but most countries also for adults, men and women. The fact that these are legal obligations upon states doesn't mean that they are limitless, unrestrictable rights. They are rights that are subject to permissible limitations. But the fact that we are speaking of legal obligations means that privacy and freedom of expression are not just arguments in the public discourse. It's not like that's an interesting position. We have another view. They are legal obligations, and therefore we must go through the assessment of what restrictions upon those rights are permissible and where must we draw a red line beyond which one must not go. One of the legitimate aims for which both rights, privacy and freedom of expression, can be restricted is national security. And that's what we usually invoke in the counterterrorism context. We can say combating of serious organized crime, or we can say public security, but usually it is national security, which refers to cross-border terrorism threats. That is not a trump card. The identification of a legitimate aim doesn't mean human rights will go away. It's only an opening phrase. Okay, let's go into the details. And then we look at the other aspects of the permissibility of limitations. Invoking national security doesn't mean that you are allowed to derogate, set aside human rights. It doesn't mean that you do an abstract balancing. Which one weighs more? Privacy of one individual versus security of everybody else. It's not a once and for all balancing exercise. It's a much more sophisticated, structured analysis of different components of what we call the permissible limitations test. Indeed, balancing comes into the picture, but fairly late, in a much more constrained area, which is called the proportionality assessment. You have the legitimate aim, you pass the other parts of the permissible limitations test, and then you ask the question whether in the end it was also proportionate in relation to the service done to the legitimate aim. No battery?
Maybe the space bar. No.
Okay.
Or the next arrow.
Yeah, I'm going to bring that now.
Frozen.
Yeah, I think it's frozen. Okay.
Try.
Oh.
Okay. Here we have the permissible limitations test, where there are different ways of constructing it, but one way is to start whether the restriction is prescribed by law. Does it leave untouched what we say the framework for the balancing? It's a fairly small part of the overall assessment of permissibility of limitations. Finally, last part of the crash course is that human rights are universal, meaning that they relate to everybody, irrespective of, for instance, nationality, and they apply everywhere, irrespective of territorial borders. Everything I've said is clear and very controversial. Also this last part, because there are countries in the world which say we have different protections for our own citizens, and that would be usually on the basis of the domestic constitution, where a country such as the US would deny the full applicability of international human rights treaties to the protection of similar rights to foreigners. Or countries like the US and UK would say, yes, we comply with human rights within our own territories, but when we go abroad, we don't go there with our human rights obligations. We are only within our own territory obliged to comply with human rights. This is extremely important in the surveillance context because a big part of the electronic mass surveillance is based on the construction that because the data flows are international, they are free game for surveillance. We are speaking of the fiber optic cables between mainland Europe and the UK and between UK and the US. The GCHQ is so centrally placed in the story because the cables pass the UK. And through some weird construction, the idea was that because the traffic is international in nature, what the GCHQ does in the UK wouldn't be subject to human rights. Of course it is. Of course it is, because it happens in the UK by UK public officials, and it affects rights of individuals both in the UK and elsewhere. Now I go back to our surveillance project. A year ago we finished an assessment of surveillance technologies in a paper which is called D2.6, Matrix of Surveillance Technologies. That looks into a traditional organized crime scenario where different methods of surveillance, 14 methods of surveillance, are applied at 19 different situations. And we do a scoring. And the multidimensional nature of the project means that we have this type of a chart where you have on the left side the usability score, which is the technology assessment. Does it work? How much does it cost? Is it worth the money? And then the other numbers are related to the fundamental rights assessment. And basically the balancing could be done by comparing the scores. Is the usability score greater than the fundamental rights intrusion score? And you could say there's some room for legitimate surveillance. The acclamation marks are a consequence of a conversion error of the file. Don't worry about that. And the color codes are the ethics. So white, no ethical issue. Green, ethical issue identified but no problem. Yellow, there's a problem. And red, no go, ethically. So we have mapped the different technologies in relation to technology, economy, ethics, and law, and come to the conclusion that some of these surveillance methods were okay because there's no significant ethical risk and the fundamental rights intrusion is clearly lower than the technology benefit. The beef of the matter is here. Now we did a similar exercise based on the Snowden revelations. We applied a sequence of electronic surveillance methods which are as close as possible to what we know about the NSA GCHQ methods. And the results are shockingly different in the sense that the security benefit, the usability score, the value for money is very low for these methods of mass electronic surveillance, while the ethics intrusion usually gives a red light and the fundamental rights scores are at the maximum level of 16. 16 here symbolizing the fact that the maximum usability score is 10 and there are fundamental rights intrusions which no security benefit can justify. We came to the conclusion that the two low-key surveillance methods used in this scenario, traditional, non-technological ones, were okay. It was opening of a suitcase and visual observation of a target through a surveillance team of intelligence officers or policemen. In those cases, there was good value for money, real security benefit, with less ethical intrusion and lower fundamental rights intrusion. Of the electronic surveillance methods, only one is subject to discussion, and that is social network analysis through the use of mass collection of data, through its filtering, through the use of algorithms. One comes to targeted individuals, and then you do a social networking analysis of their contacts. It's much more restricted, focused. There is a target, and you are looking for the genuine metadata, the connections between people, and avoiding looking into all kinds of sensitive data. And there we got to a high intrusion score, but nevertheless also a high usability score. So there we can speak of a balance. There is significant ethical risk signified by the yellow color, high intrusion to fundamental rights, but also high usability. That's the only area where, according to our results, there can be some justification and room for discussion. And in our scheme of analysis, this will result, can we improve this surveillance method so that we lower the intrusion into fundamental rights and increase the usability of that method? So we can do technological improvements which include, for instance, privacy by design solutions inbuilt into the technology. But that's the only one where there is room for discussion. The others, which were massive forms of electronic mass surveillance, are a no-go from the perspective of our results. I have a couple of things to say about protection of whistleblowers and the issue of surveillance, but I'll save them for the discussion, and I'll simply stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Turning now to Ms. Dunja Mijatovic, you are the OSCE Special Representative on Freedom of the Media, mandated to observe the media developments across 57 states, including 3 of the 5 Eyes, the US, Canada, and the UK, and also to advocate compliance with the OSCE standards. How, in your view, have the last 12 months, the Snowden revelation, the publication, impacted upon media freedom in terms of the responses from states to them across a number of states?
Thank you, Sasha. It's wonderful to be back. I feel at home already. Every few months I'm at this wonderful forum and touching upon the issues that are so important for the work of my office, but also for being able to, in a way, report to you or engage in this extremely important discussion on the issues that are giving us so much headache nowadays. And I would like to start with a phrase or a quote from a classical author, which I think it's nowadays even more important than ever before. And it's very much related to the time and the challenges that we all face because of surveillance and many other issues that are affecting our lives, not to mention freedom of expression and freedom of the media, which is really a base of the mandate that I have. And that's actually a quote from Jean-Jacques Rousseau: "I prefer liberty with danger than peace with slavery." I do not like presenting this kind of debate as a dilemma between freedom and privacy versus security, or I think it's quite dangerous to do this. I also think it's almost impossible to talk and to find the right balance, not to cross the thin line, and to do something that will affect our freedoms. But at the same time, I do recognize it's a challenge. It is an issue that is of a great importance for our societies, but I always say not at an expense of free expression and freedom of the media. Freedom should not be part of any transaction or trade. I know it sounds ideal, but we also have to realize that we do not live in an ideal world in order to tackle the issues that we are discussing here. Sajal said that I'm heading an intergovernmental organization, so I'm not heading an NGO. I work closely with NGOs, but the uniqueness, and I call it beauty, of the work and the mandate that I have is to address the governments directly. And I will immediately use the opportunity to talk about the interventions that we have in relation to Guardian newspaper with the UK government. We were very focused and very active on these issues when it all started. And of course, we are still very focused and monitoring the implementation, not to mention the importance of the police investigation and all these issues that are still quite hidden from the public at this very moment. We had an intervention which was actually addressed to the Prime Minister, David Cameron, in order to ask why there is this kind of attitude and also intrusion of the work of the journalists and media in the UK. And I can say that we had many responses and many letters also from Theresa May, Home Secretary, in relation to the detention of David Miranda, because we asked simply, is this detention anything to do with the journalistic work of Guardian? Of course, we were told not. But that doesn't mean that we did not continue to engage in this particular issue. I also visited Guardian and Editor-in-Chief Alan Rasberger in order to also raise the awareness. What I also found quite extraordinary to see a lack of solidarity of media and journalists in UK in order to support and to protect Guardian and the staff from this kind of intimidation. And I cannot call it by anything else, intimidation and harassment of journalists. And this is how I also addressed it in my letters and in my public statements and interventions. What I think it's important to mention, and it's often quite hidden or it's not used in a public discussions, governments and public officials are quite blunt, and it's very easy for them to immediately attack media and journalists when there is something wrong in relation to the leaked information. It seems that they keep forgetting that the responsibility really lies with them. The responsibility to safeguarding classified documents resides with those who have an obligation to do so: civil servants, public officials, and politicians. The persons obtaining leaked information cannot per se be held accountable for not respecting classification rules. And this is what we are facing in the UK, in the US, and in many other countries where we have discussions about the issue of leaked documents. In journalism, and what is extremely important for me in order to perform my mandate, is to actually look at the case and to see if there is this most important vital test for the legitimacy of revealing leaked information to the wider public, and that's the question of whether or not it is in public interest or not to find out about certain issues that journalists find in leaked documents. Before closing, of course, to give more possibility for discussion, I would just like to mention several issues that are extremely important for the work of the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media. I have 57 countries to monitor in relation to media freedom issues. Of course, surveillance is one of the extremely important issues, but what comes to my mind as a first issue that we face nowadays, offline and online. And I'm emphasizing offline and online because we are also facing the problem of engagement of bloggers, social media activists, and all these newcomers that are present now in interactions and communications with wider public. For the first time ever, we have audience that is active and not passive as before. And Guardian newspaper is also one of the pioneers in open journalism that we also think is extremely important also to see in connection with the surveillance and all these leaked documents that were used by different people in order to reveal something that is in public interest. Nowadays, after all these leaks, media have difficulties to report about surveillance and abuses on human rights due to expanding secrecy laws. Secrecy laws are adopted in some countries overnight without any public consultations, everything in the name of security and protecting citizens from threats and terrorism, child abuse, and many other issues. In no way I'm trying to challenge the legitimate right of any government to protect citizens from any threats. But at the same time, if we look at all these cases and if we look case by case how this affects freedoms in general, freedom of expression and freedom of the media, we have to also be very honest to say, well, it doesn't look really promising that if we continue protecting our citizens in this particular way, at the end it seems that we will end without no security and no freedoms, which is not a formula that I would like to see happening in our world. The laws that are adopted in too many, I would say, countries, all democracies, but also new emerging democracies that are also following everything that is happening in all democracies and countries with a longer tradition of free speech and freedom, respecting freedoms in general, it doesn't look rosy at all. We have almost interventions on a daily basis. And again, we go back to what we said at the very beginning, everything in the name of protection of citizens from threats, starting from terrorism and many other threats that we have present nowadays. Most of those laws are clearly and very severely targeting free speech and free media, and in a way creating an enormous chilling effect to investigative, courageous journalism that we so need nowadays in so many countries. And this is something that we will continue to focus in the next period by also tackling the issue of open journalism and also trying to find a way to assist governments not to adopt the laws that can affect free speech and free media. It's not an easy task. It's a very challenging but also very difficult task, particularly for me. I mean, no government likes to be criticized. I mean, that's the first thing, the moment you raise your voice, and that's actually the most powerful tool that I have in my toolbox. No country likes to be criticized, and no country likes to be really targeted for issues that are related to human rights. But nowadays, I think in the name of security, human rights are kind of pushed under the carpet, and it's more just words than true implementation of our rights that are so important for our lives. Last but not least, we have also seen serious cases of surveillance of journalists and their sources, and it was mentioned. Some of these cases have been condemned by the European Court of Human Rights relatively recently. There is a case in Netherlands that I will not go into many details, but I think it's in a way a landmark case that can be used for the future. Revelations about specific surveillance of journalists cause a major concern. And attacking the watchdog of democracy by tracking journalists' activities, discovering their sources, and trying to know what they know is a firm step towards totalitarian system. I know it sounds quite blunt and direct, but I cannot call it differently. And this cannot be justified on any grounds. I would also mention the case of wiretapping of journalists of Associated Press in the US that we also raised as a very serious intervention towards the US government, and many other cases, unfortunately, that we are facing almost every day.
Thank you very much, Dunya. Before opening up to questions, I would actually like to quiz the panelists myself for just a few minutes. So I'd like to pose questions to each one of you. Jill, just kind of turning back to the journalist story and going to the issue of the relationship between journalists and their sources. There has been some criticism about Glenn Greenwald as being too close to his source. So in general terms, what is the nature of that relationship between the journalist and the source, and what is appropriate and what's not. And sort of another question is, what is your hopes for legal reform in the UK, which is a very different political context and from the US? And to Martin, I'll just do the questions first before returning to them. Your surveillance project is fascinating because it really shows that electronic mass surveillance is really no-go, as you said, in terms of its effectiveness. But from a strictly legal perspective, the fact that it's mass surveillance is by its nature illegal because it's arbitrary. It doesn't go through those steps that you indicated. Having said that, the utility of your work, has that been picked up by any groups, any states, for example, wanting to use it in their critiques of the surveillance programs? And to Dunia, I don't know whether you have delved into the various debates in the United States about the Freedom Act or the Free Flow of Information Act, which are both proposed pieces of legislation which purport to either, in the first case, the Freedom Act, to limit surveillance programs, but the Free Flow of Information Act extending the protection of journalist sources. I mean, are you aware of, and what do you think of those debates there in the US? Okay, Jill.
Okay, so I think two questions for me: journalists and sources. As I said, sort of in my introduction, as a lawyer, I think it's very dangerous for the lawyer to get too close to the source. Journalistically, I think there are all sorts of potential tensions that can come up between the relationship between the journalist and the source, and one of the big ones is the source a confidential source, and what do you mean by confidential source? And even if they're not a confidential source, as I said, what other obligations does a journalist owe to the source? For example, I think that Edward Snowden was pretty savvy about what was going to come down the line once he did what he did. And we didn't need particularly to worry too much about telling him the consequences of his actions. I think maybe Chelsea Manning was a little less savvy about what might happen to her. And I think those are all things that in any source relationship, a journalist does have to think about whether they need to be saying to the source, do you realise what's going to happen? And, I think for Snowden, one of the decisions that I, as far as I'm aware, he made himself was that if he didn't come out and say who he was, there was going to be a whole sub-story going on about who he was, which in a way would have detracted from what he was wanting to say, what his message was. And for him, the message was always much more important than for him trying to maintain some hidden persona from what was going on. So, but I think these are things that are really complicated. Down the line, if the journalists got too close to the source, that might well affect evidence that's given. It might be a challenge to the veracity of the source's evidence. And then there are these whole issues, Sonoma, I think you were referring to in the Netherlands, about, journalists do have these rights. They do have these responsibilities around source protection. It's a right, but it's also a responsibility. And the law tries to challenge and undermine that in some circumstances where there is these conflicts between someone saying whistleblowers, sources are bad because they're untrustworthy, they're breaching trust between an employer or those sorts of things, against the public interest in revealing what they've got to reveal. And the pressures that can be applied on journalistic organisations can be quite extreme. I mean, years ago in Interbrew, which some of you may be aware of, another case that ended up in Strasbourg, 5 UK media organisations were given sort of back what we used to call brown bag drops. I mean, a parcel arrives, you don't know where it's come from, it's got information in it. And Interbrew, the brewer, then tried to get the document back. And the reason they wanted the document back was not because they wanted the document back, but because they wanted to find out who had leaked it. And quite often the documents can reveal who the source is. So you have to be very savvy around those sorts of things. And I think that in that case, pressure was applied to the Guardian. Ultimately, a sequestration order was put on the Guardian, a rolling sequestration order that, every day we didn't hand the thing back, there was going to be a £5,000 fine. On an organisation, that can be very telling. On the other hand, if the journalist is the one who only knows the source, and the journalist stands up and says, I'm not going to tell who the source is, those sort of pressures can be very difficult to apply in the same way. So I think there's some really interesting issues tactically, strategically for journalists when they're handling sources, and they need to be really savvy about that right at the beginning of the process. Another just touch point on sources, following the Leveson inquiry, one of the things that Leveson has recommended is that some of the source protection that's in the Police and Criminal Evidence Act around the ability of journalists to protect confidential source material, Leveson wants to remove. He wants to try to challenge. And he's doing that on the basis of saying that if a journalist is going to protect a source, there has to be effectively an express agreement of confidentiality. Now, any journalists who are in the room, how are you going to get an express evidenced agreement with a source that's going to stand up in court without going into the potential dangers of revealing who the source is? There are these little challenges going on. So sources and journalists, I think, lots and lots of really difficult issues. Second issue I can deal with more speedily on law reform. I mean, there are lots of issues around law reform. Oversight of the agencies who are performing these intrusions. Nobody doubts, we've already said, that governments need in some situations to do these things. The question is, who is checking that what they're doing is, to use the three-part test, pursuing a legitimate aim, necessary and proportionate. And what a lot of Snowden has thrown up is that, certainly in the UK, that just is not happening. The oversight regimes are not good enough, they're not transparent enough, they're not independent enough, they don't publish enough, they don't ask enough questions. Separately to that, it's quite clear that the legislation that we've got in the UK, RIPA and a couple of other bits, are just not fit for purpose in this age. So, lots of potential for reform, I think.
Thank you. Martin.
Let's go back to this quantification. The actual electronic mass surveillance methods are on top. There's the splitting of the fiber optic cable, collect it all, and then there's the next step, which is the use of selectors, algorithms, to sort out from that massive haystack anything which even remotely resembles a needle. And those are both very problematic phases. As you see on the left, the usability scores are low. So it doesn't produce real security benefit. That's one part of the answer. But then the other part is that the fundamental rights intrusion is so high that whatever the security benefit was, it couldn't justify that level of intrusion. And then we get to a little more detailed assessment of the fundamental rights intrusion, where we break it down to different factors, which are what's the weight of the dimension of the fundamental right into which the intrusion happens. How important is that dimension of the fundamental right for the person? And then the other one is how deep does the intrusion go? And on both of these grounds, these electronic methods of mass surveillance get the maximum score of 4. 4 by 4 is then 16. Then we assess, do we have reliable assessment of the law, which is basically a reference to existing case law by the European Court of Human Rights and the EU courts. And then we still say, was there judicial authorization? This could lower the score from the figure we have come to. And whatever we do, we get the maximum scores for these methods. So it's a hopeless exercise to make anything good out of these massively, as you say, arbitrary methods of electronic surveillance which target everyone, and where the underlying philosophy is simply to collect it all. You asked whether our work has proven useful. The previous scoring, the traditional organized crime scenario, that's public, in the public domain. This one, D2.8, where we look at the terrorism prevention scenario and the methods of massive surveillance, it's still ongoing work. It hasn't been formally yet submitted to the Commission. We can speak about the results, but the actual paper is still in the making. I think parallel to our work, our research on this, there's been some gratifying moments where others are picking up similar ideas. As head of the consortium, I was heard by the Civil Liberties Committee of European Parliament when they did the report on electronic mass surveillance, and we see echoes of the same line of thinking. And more importantly, the main EU court, the Court of Justice of the European Union, 5 weeks ago, 8th of April, decided the case on the illegality of the EU Data Retention Directive, which is a main instrument of massive collection of so-called metadata, which becomes intrusive through the combination of different forms of metadata. And in that ruling, which I recommend everybody to read, we have a lot of similar thinking. I mean, of course, this is not rocket science. We haven't invented a structured test for the permissibility of limitations, but it's remarkable that the EU Court of Justice uses so many similar elements, like they discuss the depth of the intrusion, the weight of the fundamental right, whether it reaches the essence of a fundamental right, and they also, similarly to us, adopt the methodology that privacy and data protection are the first order effects of the intrusion, and then unavoidably there will be implications for other fundamental rights such as freedom of association or freedom of expression, but that the first assessment is done at the immediate level through the intrusion itself, because it's targeting privacy and data protection rights through the massive collection of that data. So I would say that the ruling in the data retention case is great support to our ongoing work. Whether we manage already to influence the court through the public discourse, who knows? But that's not the point. The point is that we are simply developing further the idea of trying to quantify issues such as weight of a fundamental right and the depth of the intrusion in order to make more rational and controllable the public discourse debate, which intuitively feel some temptation to address these issues as a matter of balancing. Yes, we do balancing, but we show that there's very limited scope for the balance and that we are massively off balance at the moment.
Okay, thanks. Dunya, finally, on the legal reform in the US.
The legal reform, not just US, I would also add UK and many other countries. It's extremely important that these reforms are happening, and this is something that is discussed internationally. I was told when I was recently in UK by officials from Foreign Service that that's something that is very seriously discussed in the UK at the moment. But discussion is important, dialogue is important, but we need to see results. And what's happening in the US is slightly different because the debate is more public and it's more open for everybody to engage. But again, that's hardly to be enough. We need much more in order to say, yes, we can see certain reforms that can change the situation that is quite complicated and complex at the moment. I would also add something that I find of extreme importance, and it's not discussed that much, because everything is put aside in order to sort of discuss issues of leaked documents and editorial judgments of certain media, to publish those documents and those information, and if that is or it's not in public interest. It's important to say that the issue of security in the handling of secret documents, very often we have reports or discussions where we do not say that there is a need for some documents not to be in public domain. And those documents, it has to be decided based on case-by-case basis. And in a rule of law countries, we already have those mechanisms. So even without a reform, there is a way how to handle these things. I think what actually we are facing as a huge problem is that there are no clear procedures within agencies and offices or public offices, also when it comes to access to information or also sending or giving the information to journalists and citizens. So sometimes we have the situation that we have excellent laws and everything looks great on paper, but implementation is zero. So I think that is another level of problems that we are facing nowadays when we discuss issues of access to information and handling of the secret documents, which in a way does not directly affect free speech and free media, but indirectly, for sure.
Thank you. That sort of echoes what Edward Snowden said was his greatest fear, which is legal reform but no real policy change. Okay, so let's throw up the questions to the audience. I'll take questions in groups of 3. So who would like to ask the first question? When you ask your question, can you please identify yourself? Thank you. Yeah, over there, Christoph.
Christoph Varga, Open Society Foundations. Are you aware of or are you doing any human rights analysis of the algorithms that are being applied to the data that finally enters these systems?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, question there, sir.
Thank you. Pavel Antonov, journalist in Hungary and Bulgaria, social scientist in the UK, and a great admirer of The Guardian, and also of human rights. I'm working on an annual report on internet civil society, and for this year the choice of the Association of Progressive Communication, who's the publisher, is surveillance, which is why I'm here. And I would ask you if you could briefly reflect what is the particular challenge with the use of internet, with the use of electronic technology, in your view and in your experience. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, question there.
Hi,
Sure.
my name is Anais Lemwoski, and I'm a journalism and political science student. And I'm also an intern with Euronews here in Hungary right now. And I would just like to ask the very basic journalistic question to all of you, which is, so what? Why should we care in an era of mass surveillance, but also an era of social media, where everyone goes on the internet and posts information about their personal lives? Why should do we have reason to believe that the state actually cares about our personal lives and information, and that it's that they're using more information than just metadata, right? Because metadata is just the data and the basic information, like the phone calls and who you make the phone call to. But do we have reason to believe that the government or the state wants anything evil or 1984 scenario with our personal information? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, who'd like to answer the first question? Maybe Martin, you were nodding your head.
Can I ask all?
Okay, sure, sure.
I'll start with the last one. Yes, we have good reason to believe that governments are intending to use the data for bad purposes, and I would refer to the Greenwald set of documents which accompany the book, which can be downloaded separately, where there's clearly the idea that when you are identified as a problem by one or the other of the security agency of the state, let's see, agent of radicalization. Radicalization is political or religious ideas which your government doesn't like or is assumed not to like. then they use your personal information, including your sexual preferences or your private life habits, to put you in bad light within your own community. This is carefully reported and recorded in those documents. So it's real. It happens. What's the specific challenge of the internet? I think when we get away from the physical object to digitalization and electronic communication, we come into sophisticated legal questions of duplication of the material, there being no limit, there's no control, and then questions of global transnational law, that where's the server, where's the data located, what's the root of the data, who has jurisdiction. We come to those novel questions, which are really important, very hard to address adequately. Almost that you have the feeling, I'll give up, trying to make sense of it in legal terms. And finally, very quickly about the algorithms. Yes, they are part of our analysis in the sense that it affects the weight of the dimension of the fundamental right, what dimensions of your life trigger the use of algorithms, and then it affects the depth of the intrusion as well. What is the combination of the different algorithms? And for instance, if we speak of metadata, it can be used to track down very sensitive issues about your health, your sexual preferences, your visit to a psychiatrist, and all that through location data and combining it with, let's say, telephone metadata, who called whom at what time. So we get both to important dimensions of the right to privacy, private life, and deep intrusions into that right. So the algorithms have to be analyzed. And finally, by the way, privacy is not about the right to be left alone. Privacy is much more about the liberty of the individual, what to share with whom. And the fact that the young generation wants to share facts about their private life with their so-called friends, or even the so-called friends of their friends, it's their choice. But government intrusion to those choices is an issue of a different magnitude, which means that the right to privacy is still relevant, even if people make bad choices in the first place.
Thank you. Jill, would you like to respond to
I'll just add a few things. I mean, just there's a really fantastic play going on in London at the moment called Privacy at the Donmar Warehouse, and it's pretty much sold out. But if anyone's in London, I think it's running till the end of May, and can go and get returns. It just encapsulates all these issues: privacy, surveillance, personal data. And Snowden, and how all this links together, and the tensions that there are for all of us individually and collectively around these topics: freedom of information, privacy, security, call them what you will, and it's just brilliant. And one of the things that they do in the play is they get the audience. They do the complete opposite of what they do in most theatres, which is tell you to switch your phones off. They say, leave your phones on, leave them running, and then they start tracking what information is coming out from the audience who've left their phones on. They ask the audience to take a selfie, and the selfie gets put up on the screen. And then they start running the data that a little analyst sat in the corner is pulling out from just simply that from these people. And you would be amazed at how much personal data can suddenly be gathered together from what appear to be completely innocuous things. Everybody has location things on their phone. I mean, it's just extraordinary. So please don't think that metadata is completely harmless. It is anything but harmless. Enormous amounts of information can be put together about it. And going back to the point on sources, you don't need much to... The Guardian publishes a story on a Monday about something which is referred to as source. It is not going to be rocket science for the intelligence services to go back and say, who's the journalist who wrote that article? I'm going to go and look at his telephone calls over the last week, and I'm going to check each of those and see who they are. These things are incredibly easy. So there are all sorts of dangers around that sort of thing, I would say. And I do think that it's a bit too easy, I'm afraid, and a bit too glib to say, well, it's fine for me, I'm not doing anything wrong. You know, I mean, it's maybe we've had, you know, we live in a pretty peaceful society, most of us are fortunate enough to, and you forget the dangers of what totalitarianism can do. And the state, every state, it's not just China or the more extreme states, Russia, every state, please think, is interested in your data. It thinks it's doing it for good reason, but it's not always doing it for good reason. And what it thinks is a good reason isn't necessarily what we would think is a good reason. You know, there's a lot of subjectivity around those choices. So I just think that it's a very, very, very complicated topic. And what Snowden has done is thrown up, you know, the information that he's given us has thrown up all sorts of interesting stuff for us. The responses of the governments to the leaks has also thrown up all sorts of challenges for us. And those things are all linked in.
Thanks, John. Dunia, would you like to respond?
Just briefly, I'm not going to answer anything about algorithms because I don't have a clue about it. The issue of privacy, the issue of the internet, the openness of the internet, the importance of the internet for journalists to perform their job, I think there is even no need to talk about it, because the importance of this openness and also the way secrecy, openness, everything is challenged nowadays with these possibilities for us to interact and to have possibilities to send information in a matter of seconds, is also a dilemma of our times and something that we need to adapt to. I also see a problem with slow adaptation of public officials, of so-called digital diplomacy, virtual diplomacy, to adapt to new technologies and all these new gadgets that we have at our disposal in order to have even bigger and much greater discussion in public. To your question, I would also say yes, without going into too many details. But on privacy, I would also add for our discussion, maybe later on, that just 2 days ago, European Court in Luxembourg, they brought a decision, so-called right to be forgotten. I am quite skeptical about this decision. I think in a way it's a right to get away with things. We will follow closely. Today I had an intervention in relation to this with full understanding of the right to private life and the importance of it. But in a way I think it's quite vague, and it's going to affect in a long term free expression and investigative journalism, which is also extremely important in relation to the role of the internet for journalists to investigate things.
Martin, you wanted to come back on something?
I cannot resist commenting the right to be forgotten case by the European Court of Justice. It is a preliminary ruling given to Spanish courts, and a lot will depend on the Spanish courts, because in principle the European Court of Justice says who runs a search engine cannot have an unlimited right forever to produce in the search result everything from the background of the person. I think that's very different from the question what responsible journalism is allowed to do. So I think those reactions are wrong, which say that this is a threat to journalism. I don't think so, because the court says when there is a particular reason, such as the role in public life of the person, then there is a reason to go back to the history. So they are not banning the existence of data about persons and the right of journalists to dig into that data, but they are restricting Google so that anybody with whatever intentions can Google 50 years back about the personal history of somebody they don't like. So it says to the search engine providers that they must adjust their algorithms. Now we're back to
No,
algorithms.
I disagree, but I'll leave it for
No, well, I'll just add-
introduce filters, but
I'll
I don't
just-
think it's a threat to journalism.
I'll just add my sort of tuppence halfpenny in old UK money to this, which is that, I mean, it is interesting that in Google Spain, the fact is that the newspaper that published the material is still allowed to publish the material. The issue then comes back to the wider issue that's lurking here, which is in the internet age. Google is the way that you access that, and indeed Google is the main way that most people access the Guardian site. So if Google takes something down, it does have an effect on the accessibility of material in the Guardian's archives. And that's something that we will have to think about. But it's already interesting. Again, I'm sure some of this is scare stuff. The people who are asking to be removed and forgotten are generally those people who, in a subjective way, you would say are bad people. Good people aren't asking, on the whole, for this stuff, and it's incredibly complicated.
Okay, I think we have time for a very quick, short round of questions. Okay, so I think, Peter, I've missed you before. So question 1 here, question 2, and then the third question there. So.
Thanks. I'm Peter Molnar from CU, and I would like to ask especially Dunja and Martin about what would you see as a realistic package to push for in terms of creating a consistent set of safeguards for transparency. And when I ask this, I mean that in these debates, usually people would regard protection for journalists or citizens as already a very good result. So if they are not prosecuted, if they make something public, but people, even experts, may think that protection for public officials who leak things, it's not really something realistic that we can really try to achieve. And I myself think that without strong protection, public interest, by a public interest test for such people, there is no consistent set of rules which would protect transparency. So my question is whether you would agree to include this, that even public officials whose duty to protect classified information must have protection if they make it available in the interest of the public, according to a proper public interest test. Thank you.
Okay, yes. Second question here.
My name is Marina, and I'm a student from CEU. My question actually relates to exactly that question, because I was wondering what in your view is the ideal whistleblower protection, because it indeed seems to me that there's an inconsistency in the current legislation that journalists have protection not to reveal their sources, but the sources themselves don't really have. And I can imagine that what is now happening to Chelsea Manning, to Edward Snowden, to perhaps also WikiLeaks as a whistleblower platform, that can also have a chilling effect on freedom of expression because people are less inclined to share information with journalists. So I was wondering then what ideally would be the development of such protection. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last question at the top.
Hello, I'm Balin Palesh, soon to be student at SPP. And my question is related to the yesterday's revelations by Glenn Greenwald about the NSA backdoors installed in Cisco network devices. And I'm wondering, what are the implications when privacy by design in these network devices remain just a dream and surveillance by design is the reality?
Okay, thank you. Who would like to go first? Yeah. Martin.
Well, when I was UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, one of my reports in 2010 dealt with good practice in intelligence, and there I tried to formulate also the issues of whistleblower protection as being part of the good practice in intelligence. And indeed, also those working for public service need to be protected when they resort in a legitimate case to whistleblowing. There can be requirements that you first go through internal procedures and you try to get your message through, but if nothing else doesn't help, and there are acts, ongoing acts which are criminal in nature, then also public officials need to be protected. Another document I want to refer is to the Chwane Principles, which is a later and more collaborative effort of many actors globally to codify issues related to right to information and how it affects national security, and it deals with source protection and with protection of whistleblowers. I will leave it at there. I'll hand over to others.
Okay.
I would only add the Council of Europe as the organization also paying attention to this and offering recommendations for the protection of whistleblowers. When it comes to my Organization for Security and Cooperation, we do not produce this kind of documents, and my role is quite different. I intervene when I see there is a problem, without offering too many paperwork, but actually focusing on targeting governments that are not honoring or complying with the commitments that they voluntarily agree upon. And I agree with Peter and also with all other colleagues that ask questions on this. Yes, we need to find a way how to offer protection also to public officials. But then again, I think already now there are many documents. You just referred to several. Many international organizations are offering, again, these wonderful words, recommendations, conventions, declarations. But what the governments are doing is actually not really using this. Sometimes and quite often they have it in their laws and procedures, but then again, implementation is little or zero.
Right, and all these things are relatively new. And if we think about the Espionage Act, it's from 1917 and has no public interest test whatsoever, and that's what Snowden is being charged under. Jill?
Okay, just a couple of things. And on whistleblowing, obviously in the UK we have the Public Interest Disclosure Act, which gives people in employment situations all sorts of rights and protections. What's interesting is that, in a way, it comes back to this thing that there are moral judgments made around these things. If you're a bad whistleblower, then you don't really fit within PIDA. So, government whistleblowers are bad whistleblowers, so they don't deserve the protections that people who are in private employment whistleblowing on their employees do. You could say that's a judgment that's being made in some of these situations. So I think that it's very interesting whether there is a moral layer that overlies the protections that you get. I mean, on the other, in the UK, if you're a health service whistleblower, you're encouraged to be a whistleblower at the moment. So we have a lot of contradictions around this. And on the NSA and backdoors, I just think you have to live your life now. And maybe it's harder for people like me who've sort of, or maybe it's easier for us oldies who've sort of not embraced maybe technology quite as much as the younger people have, because we didn't grow up with it in quite that way. But, you must be naive if you think that states are not surveying and having access to and doing these things. And, the people have been writing for years about backdoors into things, and everybody's being, no, it doesn't happen. And Snowden, what Snowden showed us is that it does happen, and it has been happening for a long time. So, just proceed on the basis, and it's what I say to the Guardian journalists, proceed on the basis that you are being watched, that you are being surveyed, and if you are going to start doing something with a source, then stop, get rid of your phone, go back to the old spy drops, go back to spycraft, because actually that may be the only way you can do it. And then you still have to think about CCTV and those sorts of things. Your Oyster card, paying with your debitless card that's electronic, you have to be very, very, very careful.
Okay, thank you very much, Jill. Some tips not only for journalists, but I think for us all. We have 20 minutes break now. Thank you very much for your participation. My thanks to this great panel that we have here today, especially for this event. This event, I just wanted to say, because it wasn't mentioned at the beginning, that this event is a collaboration with the Centre for Media and Communication Studies with Kate Coyer, Eva Bogner, and Amy Brulette. The next panel will focus on our journalistic practice, and it will start at 3 o'clock. So thank you very much.
Welcome back, everybody. My name is Peter Norlander. I'm a lawyer who defends journalists. I work for an organisation called the Media Legal Defence Initiative, and our brief is to help journalists who run into legal trouble. And the panel that we have now is very much an extension of the panel that we had before the coffee break. The issues are identical, and we're going to be looking at these issues now from the perspective of journalists from Hungary, Slovenia, from Russia, who are going to be talking to us about the kind of legal framework that they operate in, how it is for them to report on issues of national security, and it's a very difficult issue for them, because the issue of national security over the last 12 months has assumed a status of tremendous public interest. It is one of the sort of top 3 issues that society is debating. And journalists need to be able to report on that freely, because it is something that the public need to be able to discuss. At the same time, they are reporting on all of this in a framework of laws that is highly restrictive. National security is often argued to be a trump card against freedom of expression. Martin Scheinin said very convincingly in the previous panel that it's not a trump card, but it is often treated as that by governments. So governments will impose harsh sanctions and will try to prevent reporting, and will try to do what they can to prevent sources from going to journalists to report on issues of national interest. So you have this situation where journalists want to be able and need to be able to report on issues of national security because they're of such importance, yet it's very difficult for them to do so. You're not here to listen to my voice, you're here to listen to 3 very real-life examples of what it's like to engage in journalism in these kind of circumstances. And I'm going to continue the tradition that was said by Sajal of not introducing the panelists. You all have handouts, you know who they are. They all have very personal experiences in all of this. And I'm going to just cut short my own mumbling and say that we're going to start with Irina, who's going to give us an overview of the Russian context of this and how the surveillance laws that have been enacted and the kind of regulations that are bubbling up, particularly since Snowden, has sought refuge in the country, how that is affecting journalism. So can I give you the floor to set that scene for us a little bit?
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. As far as you all understand, I am an investigative journalism, and I have been covering the secret services issues for more than a decade in Russia. And our website, agentura.ru, are specialized on these issues, and we set up a special project on mass surveillance on Russian citizens in the country by government and Russian secret services. As a result of this project, we found out that mass surveillance on citizens has increased has doubled in the last 6 years in Russia, and there is no oversight, and there is no control over society or parliament or from any side. As An impressive example of these surveillance programs in Russia is mass surveillance the mass surveillance system that was introduced at the Sochi Olympic Games in 2013. We investigated this case, and it was a very huge surveillance system that collected metadata on all athletes, journalists, and even officials of International Olympic Committee. And all this data will be stored in Russia for 3 years for further analysis, identification, or I don't know for what. And we also investigated Russian communication interception practices, the same practices that NSA and GCHQ implemented in their countries. And Russian approach to interception of information and to electronic surveillance is much more intrusive than American and European, because they have technical and ideological Soviet foundation that they get from Soviet times. Because Edward Snowden now in the Russia and still in Russia, Russia has a special role in the global debate over surveillance issues. And it's posed all of us in very peculiar situation, because on the one hand, Edward Snowden made his revelations to fight with intrusive surveillance against Americans, Europeans, conducted by American intelligence. But on the other hand, when Russian authorities who are spying on their citizens without control, without oversight, started to introduce the new repressive laws on the internet, they always refer to the Snowden's revelations, and they use his arguments, his revelations as a pretext to tighten the rules or to tighten the control over the internet. And we have a huge stream of repressive legislation on the internet in Russia for the few last years. In November 2012, we got a system of nationwide internet filtering in Russia, and ever since, the list of banned websites expanded and new laws adopted. Now it's happened every month. For example, but it's very relevant for Russians. 2 weeks ago, Putin signed the so-called bloggers law, which requires bloggers to register. And this law also requires to store data on Russian soil, and which might be used to put pressure on global platforms like Google and Facebook in order to force them to relocate their services into Russian. Why it is important for Russians? Because all social networks and all places when you can store your information, like Google Cloud and so on, now are not transparent for Russian secret services, are not transparent for Russia, for the Kremlin, Russian government, and so on, because there are a lot of difficulties to intercept this information. I mean technical. If these servers would be relocated into Russia, all information would become absolutely transparent and absolutely accessible for Russian secret services. So I shouldn't explain you what might be the consequences for opposition politicians, journalists, mass media, and people who are just dissenting to the authorities. Coming back to the Snowden's issues and whistleblowers, as journalists, we can't ask Edward Snowden what he thinks about this, because he refused to talk to Russian journalists since he went to Russia. But on April 17th, we've got a very surprising development. Edward Snowden was allowed to ask Vladimir Putin whether the Kremlin conducts violence on the Russian citizens. You know the answer. Putin said that they didn't use mass surveillance, they used some kind of surveillance only according to the Russian law. But so it's very common for him. But in any case, it's very positive development for us because it helped us to bring the issues of mass surveillance in Russia into the global debate. So I think it's now.
Okay, well, I'll see if I can get this to work. Yeah, that works. That's a massive sort of number of issues that you've outlined. You said it. Mass surveillance has doubled, if not tripled. The Olympics has caused a raft of activity with data now being stored for a period of a number of years.
For 3 years.
For 3 years, right. And Snowden has, of course, then intersected himself in all of this and provided the perfect excuse almost for the security services to push through what they perhaps wanted to do anyway. And all of this. Okay, so let's leave that for a moment and move over to Hungary and just hear from Tamás. So Tamás, you're a journalist with Atlas Show, and I'm not pronouncing that correctly. I'm sorry.
Yes. It's we succeeded to find the name, which is practically impossible to spell for foreigners.
Yeah, no, well done. You've succeeded. I'm Dutch. We've got a talent for languages, but I've got no idea how to deal with them. So I don't think you've got quite the repressive framework of laws in Hungary that and regulations. I mean, bloggers don't yet have to register, I believe, but maybe that's coming. But can you give us a snapshot of what you, as journalists, the sort of tools that you have set up to facilitate your reporting from, particularly on the technology side?
Okay, so Atlazo started in 2011, and our main areas are investigative journalism on a non-profit basis, freedom of information advocacy, and supporting whistleblowers and creating secure ways for whistleblowers to reach the media, because our perception is that a lot of people are not there to speak to journalists because they are afraid that there will be consequences for them if it becomes if someone knows that they turn to the press. So we called our leaking platform Magyar Leaks, which immediately created some problem because it was in 2011 and the WikiLeaks issue was still very hot. So some embassies started to inquire about what this exactly we are up to and with what we want to do. And I had to explain that it is about Hungary and on public budget watchdog activities, and we don't want to enter the geopolitical area. And finally, that was what we did. So we created first, it was PGP-based leaking platform, and now it's GlobalX, so the Tor network-based leaking platform. That means that it cannot be traced on the telecommunications networks who the sender was. And this is the highest level of anonymity we can provide at the moment for the whistleblower. The sad news is that they don't really understand, or a lot of people don't understand what is the difference between sending out an email or making a phone call or using the secure platform. So they still use more vulnerable ways to communicate with us. So it did happen. We had a whistleblower who was a fugitive. He was so the police was looking for him in a multi-million forint fraud case, and he wanted to talk to us, and he kept calling and emailing, and at last he was caught by the police. And he was not aware that he should not contact the press, especially if he is under an arrest warrant. But in other cases, other whistleblowers did use our platform, and we did a lot of good articles about leaked information. Like, it works like somewhat parallel with freedom of information advocacy. So when we started to sue the public media authority or public media fund to disclose their contracts and their budgets, and they did not do so, then we received the same information in a leak. So when people became aware that we are looking for this information, and they sent us this information. With national security, we didn't have much trouble yet. I think the closest we were to state secrets when we did an article on the Finfisher spyware, which is a commercial spy tool for governments, and WikiLeaks was leaking out contracts that indicated that Hungary is buying these softwares, and this software allows complete remote surveillance on any computer. So we did an article that Hungary has this tool, and then I got some feedback from national security people that they didn't like this article. What means obviously that it hurt their interests. In another case, we wanted to know how much is the price for the nuclear fuel for the Paks nuclear power plant, and we filed a request for the power plant to disclose, and then they, instead of telling us how they purchased this fuel, they started to classify all the information we were looking for. So basically, and back to Magyar Leaks, in 2 weeks, Magyar Leaks got police on my apartment, because in the 2011 media law in Hungary, there was no such thing that journalists source protection, and the police wanted to know the sources of one of my articles, which of course I didn't disclose, and so they took a hard drive, but the hard drive was encrypted, so they could not decrypt it. So there was a lengthy procedure, but at the end we complained to the Constitutional Court, and they demanded that the journalistic source protection must be fixed in the media law, and so it happened. So now only the court can make a journalist to reveal any sources.
So you haven't had many problems yet, but you just spent 5 minutes talking about calls from the police, calls from the security services. And in fact, I mean, how do you deal with the legal aspects of this all? As an organization, how do you deal with it?
I was very much aware that without a lawyer we will be dead in a month, so the project will be down in a month. So we started out with very good lawyers and attorneys. So we have lawyers. One of them is here in the back row, Marci. So he's our lawyer.
So you've got a high percentage of lawyers to journalists, actually, in your
actually we have 3 or 4 pro bono attorneys, and we have a full-time lawyer.
To cover the work of 4 journalists.
More or less, yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I'm just going to leave that sort of, and for people to think about as well. And move over to Anushka, who has a very personal experience, I guess, would be a very, an understatement of putting it like that. Tell us about your case.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Just a quick basic introduction. I'm a journalist at the Daily Delo, which is the largest circulating serious newspaper in Slovenia. And I am currently under indictment by the Slovenian intelligence agency for allegedly publishing classified information in an article, in a series of articles about the connections between the Slovenian neo-Nazi group Blood and Honor and the then largest opposition party, and also right now, SDS, which is led by ex-Prime Minister Janez Janša. Since my case is a little complicated even for some people in Slovenia to really grasp, I will just go back into the chronology a little bit so you know how things sort of went on. It all started in 2011, soon after the massacre in Norway, which was committed by Anders Breivik. I'm sure you all read about that. I received a tip soon after that the informal leader of the Slovenian Blood and Honor actually was active in the youth party of the SDS. That also, there were some members of the Slovenian army and police forces that were also members of the Blood and Honor. And when I say informal leader of Blood and Honor, you have a big neo-Nazi problem here too, so you probably know what that means. But there's no formal leadership that at least I'm aware of. So I have to say informal leader. Anyway, after investigating this and actually confirming the large majority of either tips or information I received through my investigation, I published this short series, and this happened shortly before the December 2011 parliamentary elections, which pissed SDS off a lot. Obviously, because a few months later, this party formed the government, and the first session of this government, the director of the Slovenian intelligence agency was changed for someone with at least informal ties to, informal sympathies, let's say, to SDS. And then nothing happened, and that summer in 2012, Slovenian Blood and Honor wrote this really interesting article on their webpage, which basically dealt with my articles. And in this article, Blood and Honor Slovenia claimed that all the information I received, that the only possible source was the Slovenian intelligence agency. And this is the first time I heard of this sort of claims. Fast forward to a year ago, pretty much, I received a summon to questioning by the criminal police regarding charges filed by SOVA, and this is SOVA is the Slovenian intelligence agency. And at that time, I also realized that the case against me was led by the state prosecutor, again with, informal sympathies to SDS. And so I was questioned, and I didn't answer really any questions. And then again, everything went quiet until this February, when a weekly in Slovenia with, again, informal sympathies to SDS published information that there was an indictment against me filed by the state prosecution with the district court in Ljubljana. And the journalists at Delo then confirmed this, so this indeed is true. To this day, the indictment was filed in April of 2013. I have no idea what the indictment says against me. All I know is that I am charged with breaching with the Article 260 of the Criminal Code, which prohibits the publication of classified information. And this is all I know. I don't know what they have on me or against me. I think probably I was surveilled, but I cannot really confirm this as the case is still ongoing. So this is pretty much my case. Thank you.
And it's by no means over, right? And
no. I wish it was. I mean, I want to know what they have against me. I just know allegedly it's a very big indictment, and that's all I know. But
And what does it potentially mean in terms of?
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I face up to 3 years in prison.
And how does it make you feel as a journalist?
I'm angry, but at the same time, I'm really happy that I can speak about it now, because I can uncover the underlying truth about Slovenia, which used to be like a model country of former Yugoslavian republics, and that there's actually some like chilling developments going on, and so. It's a bizarre situation where, on the one hand, I'm outraged that this is happening, because it shouldn't happen. I mean, they should go after the neo-Nazis that are also causing violence. They caused violence at protests, anti-governmental protests, and so on. On the other, I can use this to basically shed some light on what's going on in the country. So.
Yeah, so in that sense, it actually facilitates and it gives you a reason to do some more journalism around this. From the legal side of things, this came out of the blue, right? You weren't, of all the challenges that you might have expected. You know, as a journalist, you think about defamation laws, you think about fact-checking your stories. I mean, did you expect this? Did you see this coming?
No, I thought about defamation and fact-checking and everything, and I thought this was a very, very, very sensitive story, especially since we were publishing it very close to the parliamentary elections. I didn't want to, make a big mistake. So I did everything possible to confirm many times what I published. This is what I was thinking about, and defamation is a criminal offense in Slovenia, so yes. But no, I didn't think that the intelligence agency would press charges against me. Never, yeah.
No, and it might be a good example of how these laws are so broad in how they can be potentially used against journalists. Yeah. I mean, is this something that in Russia, is this when you do your investigations and your publishing, how do you and other journalists in Russia, how do you deal with that? How do you try to preempt or legal challenges that can be brought against you?
Frankly speaking, it's difficult, especially now. It's even impossible because 10 or 8 years ago we have a clear legislation on revealing state secrets, and journalists were not an object or subject of this legislation, because if somebody reveals state secret and it was published on the media, the person who I saw some information should be punished. But my colleague Andrei Soldatov and I had problem even with this, because many years ago, when we published a story about a collection of the FSB is the main Russian secret service, published a story on the collection of FSB sites in the Moscow, including their buildings and secret underground object. The intelligence set up a criminal case against us, but. And they try to present us as a member of criminal group that had a purpose to reveal state secrets and get some money from newspaper for publishing a sensation. But because it used to be a former legislation, and journalists were beyond the punishment. We were interrogated many times in the building of Lefortovo prison, where the investigative department of the FSB situated. And but eventually they seize the case because we replied on all these questions about our source that we didn't remember exactly name, exactly appearance of the man, because it passed some time. But now it's impossible to avoid because the legislation was absolutely changed for last few years, and now you can be punished even for passing information that could be deemed harmful for the state. It's very wide definition, and it would not implement it yet, but it's very difficult to survive in this situation, and we don't know how to operate in future right now.
Yeah, so it's a big question mark, and it's sort of the threat of the criminalization of journalism that's hanging over you. And you mentioned that you used to be able to get away with this in the past by saying, I don't quite remember who the source was for that story, and and Tomas, that's something that you and others in Europe as well are trying to do by setting up these platforms to facilitate leaks. So you mentioned Magyar leaks. There's obviously WikiLeaks in the Netherlands. There's a similar platform in Italy. Journalists have set up, very similar platforms. But that then raises all sorts of other issues about sources, because as journalists, you do want to. You're not merely a vessel that conveys information that has been brought to you by an anonymous leak, right? You do your own storytelling around that, your own vetting around that. So how do you deal with information that comes from a source that is so highly anonymous that you as the journalist, let alone Jill said the lawyer doesn't want to meet the source, okay, right? But in your situation, the journalists don't even meet the source. You have the digital equivalent of the old-fashioned brown envelope that is dropped in the post. How do you go about dealing with that?
Yeah, of course, we need to verify all these leaks so they don't get published immediately. So in fact, most of them don't get published ever because there is a lot of personal stuff or personal problems coming in, or a lot of other stuff which is not of public interest. So we just pick the ones which are of public interest, and we can verify it, because of course that the source is anonymous. That doesn't mean that we don't have to prove it on the court if it's necessary. So we are regularly sued by some people who we feature in our articles, and so all these articles get a very thorough legal check before published, and we can defend them on the court as well.
Yeah, so that's about very clear fact checking. I think we've had a good overview, and I've got many more questions of my own, but I'm pretty sure that people in the room will have questions as well. So I wanted to just throw it open and see. And I've taken the microphones by surprise because they now have to be collected. So, do we have questions in the room? Okay, there's one.
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
I already introduced myself. Pavel Antonov, I'm Bulgarian, live here in Hungary, a journalist, social researcher of media practices. 25 years ago, our nations woke up from a bad dream, and we all thought it's the end of it. We thought there will be freedom of speech, we thought there will be democracy, there will be also market economy. Here we are today, hearing this story from Russia, and no one is even surprised to hear that Mr. Putin is oppressing journalists. Hearing a story from Hungary, well, okay, we've heard about Hungary things, okay, not so surprising. There comes Slovenia, the best case. We heard earlier today from England. So I can't help but asking the question, as journalist to journalists, what's going on? Where are we heading? And what are we to do about this? Do you see a light in the tunnel? What can we do about this? Thank you.
In Russia, I guess we have the worst situation on the media freedom and especially right now, because we had an independent media only on the internet for last few years. Everything else, from TV channels to traditional paper, was under control of the Kremlin. But a couple of years ago, the Kremlin started to improve the situation from his point of view on the internet too. And just last month, the independent internet website lenta.ru was blocked by the authorities, and after that, the chief editor was changed. So it's you can see that it was a political decision, and 3 of independent websites, some of them opposition media, was blocked without any explanation, and exception that they contained some sort of extremism, and they are still blocked. So today, one officials said officials who represent the agency that is supervising over internet in Russia said that that Twitter and Facebook may be blocked, and he see no problem with this. So I don't know. It's clear direction, but we as journalists didn't find a decision to this right now, because we used to work on the internet independently, but now everything is changing.
I agree with you. What is going on? But actually, what is going on is that nobody's immune anymore. This happens. We can see it in the UK, in the States, in all the developed Western European countries, and like former model new democracies like Slovenia, and it's all over. So I think the point came. We are at the point where we need to ask ourselves, what are we going to do? Because at the moment, I see there's a great divide between what the governments and corporations are able to do in the realm of data extraction and gathering and storing and all of that. On the other side, there's the vast majority, in my view, of journalists who are actually not who don't have enough knowledge as to how to protect themselves, their data, their sources, and so on. And then there is the general public, which is even more sort of lost. So I think this is what we need to discuss about a lot.
Tomas, do you see light at the end of the tunnel?
I don't like this type of questions, because I don't think we are fortune tellers, so I don't know what is next and what is coming, but it's very clear what we have to do now is to protect these freedoms of journalism, and that's it. And you don't have to think about what will be next. It's unnecessary.
Freedom of journalism and also the public's right to know. Those two are very, very closely interconnected here.
Well, yeah, and I was going to say, I don't think it's wrong to see it as a light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing. It's almost a natural development. It's an ebb and flow. But what is a constant here is that there is now journalism going on, and there's good quality journalism going on in countries across the world. And some people don't like that, and laws are being brought into action to repress that. But ultimately, you see that the journalism does actually come through, even though there are stories that can't be published for various reasons. The good journalism will still go through, and I think we've reached a point, particularly with the internet, that even if Putin now wants bloggers who have more than a certain number of followers, right?
Three views.
Yeah, 3 views a day, right? Okay, so that's more than the immediate family. I didn't know the number was that low. That's interesting. But journalism has a tendency of finding a way around all of that. And so I'm not as pessimistic about it as perhaps you are. We've got this has sparked a whole bunch of questions from the left of the room, so let's go there. We got plenty of time.
I'm just sitting on the left. It doesn't imply any.
Well, you're sitting on the right, sort of from your point of view.
No
I'm on the
political
left.
implications should be drawn.
I think left and right is an old. Anyway.
I'm Dean Starkman. I'm a fellow at the CMCS here and at the Nation Institute in New York, and also an editor at the Columbia Journalism Review, and that's enough of titles. But I was thinking that the question of what's going to happen is one thing we can put aside, but with the internet now, more and more journalism faces common problems globally. And so basically it boiled down to a couple. One is this idea of mass surveillance and in protecting our sources, whistleblower protection. And the other, of course, is government control of the internet as a means of of distributing the news. I'm wondering, is there any organized effort for journalists and journalism to come up with a common strategy? I mean, I understand that we're all fierce, stiff-necked, and independent, but is anyone aware of, or have we thought about coming up with a common strategy for tackling these two big problems?
No, and I'm sorry. No, and I'm sorry we don't. I mean, I think we should.
I was just going to say.
And your meaning? I mean, you mean a concerted effort at the national level, or
no,
international? I'm just thinking. Even I've been a journalist for 30 years, but I don't know the first thing about really about protecting sources in this era of mass surveillance. Is there an effort to come up with best practices, for instance, for journalists to? I mean, what we do now really puts people at much more risk than we used to. It's not really us that we, of course, journalists, we are concerned about ourselves and our freedoms, but also it's really the sources that we have to really look after, who are the most vulnerable, as Snowden has learned. So I don't know. I'm always surprised that there's no no effort to kind of collectively tackle or think through these problems that really everyone's facing from the U.S. through the U.K. through Russia and of course China. I don't know. It just seems time to get organized.
Yeah, you may have identified a research need there or an organization need at the. I'm aware of a few efforts at the national level, and maybe Tomas.
I think that, in my opinion, there is a lot of effort on the international level. I'm part of some journalists' mailing lists, and these topics are always coming up, and there are plenty of projects aimed on these problems. And the journalists are networking and exchanging information on these topics. So I feel it's much more international and much more networked than maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, that is true, and there is a lot of opportunities to learn data protection tools, protect your computer communications, all of that. However, there is no concerted effort, like a group effort, to fight back on to prevent this sort of harassment by governments, corporations, whatever, of journalists and media to become the practice, something that is perfectly normal. I fear that we are coming to that.
I think this will become something like media literacy, that you have to reach a level on cyber security literacy. Just this week we were teaching this to university students on the university, so this must become a part of the basic curriculums.
I mean, Peter, can we put that question back to you? And from your perspective, that's working, across many different European countries with both, European frameworks and standards, but also very specific domestic laws and policies, working with a range of journalists. If we could turn that question to you and see what from your vantage point and from the work that you do, if you could say more on that.
Yeah, and I was actually going to point that out. That I think and this reflects part of what you were saying, Tomas, as well. You're part of a bunch of mailing lists, and it's just the reality is that there's no sort of global organization to which all journalists belong and which drives everything. But there are a lot of efforts at the regional level in Europe. There's a lot of standard setting being done within the within the Council of Europe, for example, on these issues. And then there are groups such as the Community to Protect Journalists that try to raise awareness around various of these issues. What is probably true is that there's not enough being done of that, and that is part of there aren't the resources and media. Media don't always cooperate in these things in the way that perhaps they should be, and they don't always join forces in perhaps the way that they should. There's envy between media organizations that might stop them from doing that. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but there is a bunch of things going on, and there's also a bunch of reasons why people aren't collaborating. But I just wanted to move to Peter Molnauer, who has a question to this as well.
Thank you, Peter. On the end of the light at the end of the tunnel thing, that I wonder how you see the sort of a divide between civil society, including the media and journalists, pushing for standard setting, and those who are on the other side of politics, not in the sense of left and right, but who are in power, so-called. And it seems to me that certainly in Hungary recently, there is something that I call civic populism, which is about that those who are not in the role of a professional politician are the nice and committed people, and those who are in power as politicians may not stand for anything in a consistent way because they are just corrupt. And I see the point that politics corrupt, of course, but I also think that we need allies among those who are in the decision-making position, who can vote in national parliaments and elsewhere for measures that we are pushing for. So what I am asking that in your experience and in your national context, to what extent there is a productive collaboration between media and civil society, other parts of civil society, and so-called professional politicians who can make the decisions, setting aside the way of direct democracy, which is important, but still things are decided in places where people are authorized to vote for things. So if there are not enough allies among them, standard setting may get very limited influence. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's actually a question that I would like to pose to the rest of the panel as well. And you started by saying that there's a sort of a disconnect between standard setting at the Council of Europe and at the United Nations and recommendations coming out of these various intergovernmental bodies, and then what happens to those recommendations actually on the ground in countries. So there are lots of recommendations that talk about how government should, treat whistleblowers. The Council of Europe just came out with a new recommendation in April, and there are recommendations around the protection of sources, and there are recommendations about how libel shouldn't be a criminal offence, within the Council of Europe as well. And what happens to those recommendations? And I definitely agree with you that there is a strong disconnect there, and it's something that we come across in our work a lot. I wanted to pass the part of your question that is about, is there an awareness among civil society in your countries or in your regions that this needs to be counteracted, and who is driving any sort of legal reform? Who's driving any law reform on this? Who's putting pressure on the governments to change?
It's clear that it's not a question for to Russian speakers because I feel very bad to be out of this discussion because it's clear that the independent mass media can't any possibilities to affect parliament on the parliament or Russian officials, and there is no any mechanism now.
But yet, you as journalists, you carry on, right? Because you're not stopping your work. You're
no,
not going home
we
and
just
sort of
we
blogging
just
about
keep
your cat.
publishing our investigations and stories, and that's all. But there is no direct or indirect effect on government or parliament.
Right, and I think Anushka had the same answer. But
yeah, I mean, I'm sorry. It's not just Russia, you know. It's the Slovenia, same thing. I feel that no, there's not a lot of concern about this because I guess people are just overloaded with everything, and even if there is a big story that comes out 3 days later, they'll forget because somebody killed someone with a hatchet or something, you know. So it's like there's not really much awareness of what's going on or the health of a particular democracy. However, in Slovenia, if we're talking about civil society and so on, I mentioned earlier, just very shortly, that we had protests, anti-governmental protests, and a lot of like sort of new leftist, center-leftist parties are stemming out of that movement now. I don't know how they will do in the elections and so on, but at least partly there is some waking up in the civil society. And you were mentioning something about libel and so on. And
well, the fact that,
yeah. Well, this again is something that nobody is addressing in Slovenia. Also, we have currently several cases of state authorities trying to track down whistleblowers, so employees at certain state institutions that blew the whistle on something or just forwarded information to journalists. The Market Competition Protection Agency has been looking for sources or their employees who were sources of several articles a month ago. So, and nobody's really addressing this. I find that even in the journalists community, there is not enough of awareness. And like as you mentioned before, no solidarity between media and so on. It's like it's happening to them. We don't really, we're fine.
In Hungary, I am a bit more optimistic because we had our successes. Like I mentioned, source protection, it became part of the media law. But in other instance, when we were pushing a lot of freedom of information requests, then the government changed the law to limit the scope of freedom of information, not to be, so you cannot be able to file requests for bulk information. So I think, of course, this is never an issue for the masses or not. You cannot build a very huge movement around such very complex and abstract issues, but still there are chances if you can raise the attention and you can do a good campaign on the internet, then the government will at least feel pressured by what you have done.
And do you? And I was intrigued by that remark you had in your opening sort of 5 minutes when you said that the Constitutional Court was actually on your side on source protection, for example. And now you mentioned that again. Would you say that the courts are still out there looking out for protection of your rights?
I think the courts are very journalist-friendly nowadays in Hungary. I can state that even in freedom of information cases, we win the 2/3 of the cases. So often it depends on who is the judge, but they are more and more understand the importance of freedom of information and the free press. and even in libel cases. So in Hungary we have criminal libel as well, and a lot of actors use it against journalists to silence them. So we have a journalist who has now 2 libel cases simultaneously, but in the courts are most often they rule for the journalists. So I think I can't complain on the courts really.
That's interesting. Yeah. Go on, yes, please.
Hello, my name is Fanny Hidvégi and I work for the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union. And I just had a few remarks on how we can push towards better legislation. You know, we don't have a law on lobbying in Hungary, nothing at all. So that's interesting how you can communicate with government without that. And now we are part of the procedure of the criminal procedure codification, and we are in a dialogue to terminate libel and defamation from the criminal code, which has been our long aim. And I'm so envious of Tamás because he's so, I don't know, you're so positive about the courts all the time. And I have completely the different experience. And I think it's getting harder and harder to win freedom of information cases.
But Thomas just said that he wins 2/3 of them.
Well, maybe they initiate secure ones. I don't know. If you try to test them, if your strategic litigation aims not only to get the data but to test the ruling, I think the score is going a little bit lower.
Do you have any questions? Yeah.
Sorry, I would just like to add a comment to what you said. That actually requesting information in Canada, which on like rankings and scorings usually scores higher on the democratic level than Hungary does. It's much more difficult to access information in Canada than it is in Hungary, even with the modifications to the current laws, to the previous laws. So it's actually it's interesting.
Hi, Scott Griffin from the International Press Institute in Vienna. You sort of already answered my question. This is for Anushka, which was going to be sort of a little bit more about the public reaction, not only to the charges against you, I guess because it's been made public now, you said in February, but also to the original story itself. I mean, you mentioned this thing, people forget a story after 3 days. You were saying this, and I wonder whether this is playing a role, whether this facilitates the kind of charges against you that the government feels empowered because there's not a lot of, either there's not a lot of public reaction to the charge, or there's not a lot of reaction to the story itself. So maybe perhaps you can explain a little bit more about this. I mean, the other panelists can comment as well, whether there's sort of a democratic deficit going on, whether it's playing a role. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Well, I'll start at the end. I have mentioned it elsewhere that I'm very disappointed and actually disillusioned with the reaction, even within the journalistic community in Slovenia, to this charge. Not because it's against me, but because it is the charge that it is. We haven't seen that in about 14 years or so in Slovenia. Consequently, the reaction of the public was not really, nobody really touched the subject a lot. But luckily I have a lot of colleagues and I'm a part of a network, and so the word on my case got around and came into the country from the outside, which is always a good strategy if people are silent. And democratic deficit, yes. Well, it's complicated because the charges were brought against me under the previous government. So this was the Janša's one-year government, and the government fell, and we got a new government which is leftist. and now this one fell. So, well, democratic deficit, yes. I mean, the time when we had the sort of center-right government, the democratic deficit was shown between 2005 and 2008 in like large-scale media censorship that was going on and political usurpation of actually my paper, Delo, and the public television and so on. But this has subsided now. We will see what happens, though. But in short, I think a case like this, a criminal case against a journalist for doing his or her job, which definitely was and is in the public interest, is definitely a sign of some sort of a deficit in a society. I don't know if this answers your question.
And what I think was interesting in your case, as well, we were chatting about this over the coffee break, is that Dunja Mijatović's office of the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, you were so frustrated with the lack of any action sort of in your country that you activated her office.
I didn't activate her. Her office contacted me. I don't know how it happened, but
she activated. She
came into action herself.
Yeah, but that had a real impact because that then forced the government to come and explain themselves.
Yeah, but like I said, it's funny because now there's a different government, and this government has nothing to do with my case, and obviously the prosecution and the courts are independent, and no political party will overtly meddle with a case at a court, right? In a model country.
Sure. Yeah.
So there's no.
But they also don't operate in a vacuum.
No, they don't operate in a vacuum, but they can pretend that they are in a vacuum because they have nothing to do with this. Yeah. It's the previous government, it's the previous leadership, it's the previous director of the intelligence agency. So basically everyone's hands are clean, but I'm still under indictment, which is wonderful.
Were you going to add something? No, you don't feel that Russia is on this. I wanted to talk about Russia more. Yeah, no, we'll get back to Russia. What I wanted to ask, and I know there's a question in the back there, but what I wanted to ask is also about internationalizing it all. And you alluded to it just now. You're both a part of the organized crime and corruption network, which is not the correct name for it. But it's something like that, and you know what I'm talking about.
Reporting network, not the network itself, but we report on it.
It's a reporting project.
It's a reporting project on international.
OCCRP.
That's the one. OCCRP. How does that strengthen you as journalists, particularly when you report on really sensitive topics, or does it strengthen you?
I'll be really quick and. In my case, OCCRP issued a statement before anyone else in Slovenia. So, very good. Tamas.
Yeah, I think it's very good to have such networks because it allows you, if you have any problem, then it's really helpful. So, it allows you to ask for help for several countries. So.
Some of my colleagues in Russia are to take part in some investigative journalism initiatives, and especially investigating organized crime, because it is international. But I didn't investigate organized crime, so I and my colleague Andrei Soldatov got forced to find information on ourselves, and an international exchange isn't very fruitful here because of the topic is a secret because the topic is secret services in Russia. But in terms of fighting with terrorism, sometimes we asked our colleagues abroad for some information, but only based of personal acquaintances because the sensitive of the topic. Yeah. So, but I think it's a great thing to cooperate with each other.
Yeah, both in terms of information sharing, but also in terms of sharing techniques and
Yeah, for instance, when I first contacted OCCRP, I didn't know how to track down these offshore companies, and in Hungary, the white-collar crime did use offshore companies a lot. And then, in a case, they helped me out with the company data, and it was a real breakthrough in that case, because we find names in the offshore companies, so that was really, really helpful.
I asked our Bulgarian colleague if I could claim temporary eminent domain over the microphone since it's in my hand, because on this very subject of networks and collaboration, I wanted to stay on that topic for a moment, because one of the aims of this project that is the impetus for these discussions taking place today, that the European Commission is funding as part of a pilot project to strengthen media freedom and independent journalism in Europe. And so one of the questions related to that is, based on this discussion we're having, what's missing and what would you specifically recommend is needed? Because it sounds like, there are a lot of different networks and there are tools that are out there that can be accessed for journalists on better security, better privacy, better, how do you deal with, as you just said, Tomasz, getting information from places that it's really difficult and totally non-transparent, like corporate information. And what can the Commission do to support this? Are there the need for new networks or new infrastructure or better communication of what's out there? Or is it a funding issue? Do we need more funds to support some of this stuff or to support better collaboration? If I could just stay on that and push that back for a second. To all of you, including Peter.
Well, Tomasz, you're holding the mic. Why don't you go first?
Okay, so in my opinion, it would be important to teach cybersecurity for mainstream media because really it's the journalists who could educate their sources, but if even the journalists are not aware of the techniques. So there is a very good NGO which is called the Tactical Technology Collective, and they are producing excellent websites on cybersecurity and workshops and so on. And maybe it would be worse that not only the NGO world but mainstream commercial media would learn that skills.
Funding. I do work at a media that just celebrated 55 years of existence, so we're supposedly funded. But in terms of independent outlets, it's really tough, especially when you come from a country that is a member of the European Union, to get funds. A colleague of mine tried to set up an investigative journalism center in Slovenia. It's practically impossible to set it up unless you have to basically be doing something for 2-3 years before you're even eligible for funding. In this sense, I have to say, I don't want it to come across wrong, but our colleagues on the outskirts of EU have a much better hand here.
Yeah, that's very true. That because a lot of grants are like USAID grants are eligible for non-EU countries, so the EU countries can't get them, and the EU has not similar grants for independent media. So it's a struggle to finance this type of NGOs here.
I'm sorry, just one more thing. A good illustration, a colleague is in Italy, formed an investigative reporting center, I think last year, IRPI. And one of the founders, I just found out, is right now so desperate that she's ready to start working as a real estate agent because she just can't pay her bills, and they're doing really, really good, important work there. They have already done a couple of really, really, cross-border European investigations into fake olive oil, into mafia, you name it. But this woman that's doing such a good job can barely survive. So we have a problem here. And mainstream media outlets are just not, I'm lucky. At Dilo, I have a little bit more time than maybe some other colleagues and I can do something. But there are many that are not as lucky as me that are working at a mainstream media. So we need these independent outlets, and we need this extra work being done from NGO journalist centers, right? 5.
In Russia, if you got some foreign funding, you would be labeled as foreign agent, and you should be registered as a foreign agent. So this is the end.
And that's coming to Hungary now. So really, the Hungarian authorities or the Hungarian governing parties are considering to register foreign-funded NGOs as foreign agents.
Yeah. Well, let's leave that aside. But I think the picture that you get here really is that there's barely enough money in the media, and the independent media particularly, to just make ends meet. And it's the independent media who publish these kinds of stories, right? Because the more commercial media don't do it. They're not covering it. And so the independent media can barely make ends meet, and therefore they don't have the resources for the protection, for the investigation that they really need. And that protection goes from physical protection to data protection to legal protection as well. You know, you've got a good team of pro bono lawyers working for you. And you're fortunate, I think, in that regard, because many others don't. And in terms of data security, there's so much that journalists should be doing that they aren't doing. It's almost shocking. So there's a lot of investment, I think, needed there. But you were hogging the microphone on behalf of.
I will turn my question upside down now, because I think the discussion that came from this one sort of brought another point of view to it. But should we easily accept and agree that we have lost the ground of mainstream media for quality investigative journalism? Is an issue that bothers me a lot. And unfortunately, it's an issue that doesn't only affect our countries. We had the case that was mentioned in the UK a few years ago, where News of the World was spying on people's phones for years with the participation of secret services, and everyone in the journalistic and media circles knew about this happening until The Guardian actually started ringing the bell. In my country, as a much more extreme case, we've had 90% of the editors-in-chief disclosed as state security agents at different stages. We have a penetration of state security apparatus into media, which is really probably not unprecedented, because I'm sure there are other countries which have it even worse. But this is a major part of the problem. So my point was, we should be just careful when we sympathize. We all sympathize with journalists doing a good job. It's just that part of the problem lies within our profession. And we should, as journalists doing a good job, somehow have a way to isolate and exclude those who are actually Secret Service agents, maybe, or who knows what, and they dominate the media around us.
They can just do a really bad job.
And I think we shouldn't allow us to become only NGOs who struggle for funding, while the big media getting the EU funds, by the way. EU pumps millions in every of our countries in the media, but this money goes to the mainstream media, not to good journalism. Thank you.
I don't know if Dela ever received a dime from Europe. I wish we had, because then we would have a better. But we were talking about the light at the end of the tunnel. I think The Guardian, in the sense of among the major media, definitely is becoming, or is a light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, they have done really, really good investigations in the past few years, and thanks to The Guardian, we know a lot more about surveillance. We know about the hacking that you mentioned, and so on. And through that, you know, the practices of News of the World were discarded, or I hope they were. But yeah, I mean, I guess journalists are sort of strange people that really love to talk about everyone else doing something wrong and pinpointing the wrongdoing in others, but they're not so quick to review or reflect on their own profession and so on. So I think we need to do more of that, definitely. But as I said, you don't have to be a Secret Service agent. You can just be a really bad journalist, and if if everyone's tolerating you, the damage is pretty much the same.
In Hungary, most of the investigative journalism is already on the internet. So not the printed press, especially not the television, is doing this, but internet. So websites or news sites are more active or most active in the investigative journalism field. And in the printed press or television, there are some partisan investigative journalism, but it is aimed on the other party usually.
As far as I understand, some parts of question concerns on secret agents in the media. In Russia, we have not a lot of secret agents inside the media, and we don't need this because in the country with authoritative regime, the authorities have a much more effective tools to affect and to control media than some people from secret services in the media. I've met some people from secret services in Russian newspapers, and they have never concealed this fact even in 90s because we have now any punishment for former KGB agent, and it's such type of things was acceptable, widely acceptable, and so I don't think we need to. But now it might be accepted as a advantage. If some journalists have secret services background in Russia, so nobody conceals this facts.
It's not about. I mean, you talk about kicking people out of the profession. That seems to be the wrong approach. You should be promoting what works well. You should be celebrating the really good journalism and not worry too much about the inevitable few, really bad journalists or people who are infiltrated by the Secret Service, which, by the way, has happened in my country as well, in the Netherlands and in Germany, and elsewhere. So it's not a uniquely Eastern European problem. And in fact, my own country has a particular problem because the police think that because they operate in a democracy and because there is the rule of law, they don't have to always follow the rules, right? Because they mean so well. And surely they're doing the right thing. So they can go to a media house and say, just give me that CD with, or give me that USB stick. And we know that we don't actually have the legal power for you to force you to hand it over, but we're going to ask you to do that anyway, because otherwise we're going to occupy your media house. And it's sort of those sorts of weird sort of excesses that you get in a country where the police just get too comfortable. But what you do see then is that the courts do eventually stand up, and say, hang on, you can't do that. So that's not a light at the end of the tunnel, but it's it's just a system that does operate, and the police will have these tendencies. It's almost in their DNA to behave in the way that they do.
And I think often the problem is not with the police, but with the journalists who don't even know that they have a right to refuse any request from the police. So when I had this case with the police, I asked the investigator that, do you often ask journalists for their sources and for information? And yeah, and they are all cooperating. We have never had this much trouble than with you.
Because you're right.
Yeah, because simply if journalists don't know that they have the right to be silent in such a situation, and they cooperate and give all the information proactively to the police.
Jill, yeah.
I was just going to add parking, phone hacking. That even in the UK we have had these similar things. Sally Muir was a journalist on a local paper 4 or 5 years ago, doing really run-of-the-mill stuff, but obviously antagonised the local police enough for them to feel it was perfectly acceptable to bug her phone, bug her car, and do all sorts of things. And as Peter said, what happened at the end of the process was that the courts were the ones who sort of saw it out and said it's not acceptable. But police, like governments, do feel that, again, it's this moral issue. We're right, so therefore sometimes it justifies us doing bad things to others. And there's that, comes back to the big question around, legitimate aim, proportionality, necessity, which is a language that, we should be using and spreading out for all these things, because it is what's important. Nobody's talking about absolutism here on either side. So, I think that in every country there are these issues that are really difficult ones.
Yeah. Granted, in some countries they're a little bit more difficult than in others. I think that certainly is clear. But that is a good point to make, and also the fact that journalists just aren't aware of the law and they aren't aware of their rights, and so it's hard as a journalist to navigate restrictive legal frameworks. But at least when you are doing that, here on the panel, and you know that framework is there. And there are too many journalists, I think you're certainly saying, Tomas, who just don't know what their rights are and they don't know what the law is, what they can and cannot write. So that's another need, I think, that if you're into identifying needs, there's a strong need there that people need to be still made aware of their rights. I think we've got time for another round of questions.
I'm sorry, I haven't introduced myself before. I'm a journalism and political science student, and I'm interning here at Euronews in Hungary. And I was just wondering then, do you think education would be the answer to this problem? Because maybe this is a very Eastern European specific problem, because I'm from Hungary, but I'm also from Canada, and I know that in Canadian journalism schools, for example, they make us take communications and journalism law so that we know exactly what our rights are. So do you think this could be an answer even to this specific problem?
Actually, yeah, I just wanted to mention earlier that maybe there is a problem with the curriculum at journalism schools in Slovenia. I mean, with the Bologna reform and everything, things got a little better, and in first year students actually have some sort of law basics and so on, but it's not enough. I don't see a trace of teaching journalists of how to use online research techniques, tools, data analysis, like all of the things that we are all using now. It's non-existent in the curriculum. Security that you mentioned, and we've been talking about it today a lot. And like in Slovenia, journalists are taught. They tell me that there is no investigative journalism in Slovenia, and that it's ridiculous to do investigative journalism.
But you do it.
Yeah, but I'm saying they're creating journalists who will not ever have guts to take on a government institution, a company, or anything. They are creating journalists that will love it when they can copy-paste agency news and maybe call 3 people for statements, So this is a problem, and maybe the curriculum in journalism schools, at least I can speak for Slovenia, is just a little backwards. I mean, it's a little behind in the previous century.
I agree with this. In Hungary, often there are a lot of journalists who didn't educated in journalist school, but they finished something else. It's quite a new phenomenon in Hungary that we have communication education, so it needs to be refined.
In Russia, I don't think that on journalism faculty, I don't know exactly, but I don't think their teachers teach their students how to have a deal with big data and so on. And I think it's more practical questions than questions of education. But what would be really important is to teach journalism students and even journalists how to protect themselves from surveillance, any kind of surveillance here in Russia and abroad. it's very, very important in conflict zone too, not only in Russia. And the fact that I know the Sakharov Center in Moscow have maintaining a great job trying to invite people from Tor Project and Privacy International and other organizations who are focused on protecting privacy and sources of information, and SOC Convention tool how to find access to blocked resources on the internet, and it's only one example that I know. I think it's only one.
So that needs to be strengthened. There is potentially a lot of support out there, right? And it just needs to be there needs to be more of it. And it needs to be more systematic.
It's very good and have a very positive effect on journalism.
I'm going to just on that subject of support. Actually, Peter, if you could say a couple words about your organization, because the Media Legal Defense Initiative also is plays a significant role in terms of providing support and legal support. And again, if you could say more about what resources the initiative itself has.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to plug my own work. We are lawyers who help journalists, and journalists get into legal trouble. They get sued for libel. They get sued for national security offences, and we try to make sure that they've got good lawyers available to defend against those charges, and that's particularly needed for independent media because they don't have the resources that large commercial media houses have. So people can come to us. We also partner with organizations in country who we fund to hire their own lawyers onto their staff to provide those pro bono services that are so, desperately needed for these independent media. And we try to somehow redress in that way the imbalance between business, who often sue for libel and who have a lot of money and who can hire the expensive lawyers to silence journalists, and the journalists themselves who work for media outlets that are penniless to all intents and purposes. So that's what we try to do. Our website, mediadefense.org, has more on that. So that's one positive note. I also wanted to end on another positive note. So we are one resource that's on the legal side. There are these other resources on data security but all of that is at a level that just needs to be upped. We are one organization that tries to preempt all of this with a very small staff and a very small sort of financial resource, and there just isn't enough firepower among the journalist community. There isn't enough firepower among the sort of the data security community. There needs to be more of all of that to facilitate public interest journalism going into the future, in my view. And with that, I'm going to close the panel. I think we've reached, and we've had a really interesting overview of the actual challenges that you face on so many levels, from just keeping the media outlets ticking over, making sure that journalists who are doing a really good job aren't forced to go and work in real estate because they can't afford to work as journalists anymore, making sure that journalists know their rights so that when the police do show up, they can say, no, actually, you can't have that USB stick. That's journalistic privilege. You can't have that. Making sure that the journalist curriculum teaches them the skills to actually do their work as journalists. So definitely more investment in all of that needed. And then it's not really an issue of light at the end of the tunnel. It's just keep on doing really good public interest journalism of the kind that all of you are doing here, even in Russia. So I'm probably less pessimistic than all of you are. But on that note, I'd like to thank all of you very much for coming here.
I'm tired to be the worst person here.